This is obviously a very timely event, given the emergence of a new pope whose choice of name quite consciously anchors his papacy within a discernible Catholic social teaching tradition. But it's also an important timely event for other more disturbing reasons. Recent election results in this country suggest a step change in support for populist authoritarian forces. We have a wider global ascent of these authoritarian forces. We have a government who is cratering in the polls despite being elected by a landslide barely a year ago. So the obvious question, I think, which will dominate a lot of discussion today is what resources are available both to diagnose the current situation, arguably one that threatens the very foundations of liberal democracy. And when Anna kindly invited me to say a few words, I was going to talk about the historic links between Catholicism and the Labour tradition, something I'm quite obsessive about actually at the moment. And I was going to frame my comments around this relationship because I think it's got real contemporary relevance in terms of a government which appears to lack purpose. So what resources has it got within its own tradition to try and navigate out the future? Last year I wrote a book to coincide with the centenary of the first Labour government in 1924. And what I tried to do is relitigate Labour history by reintroducing some spiritual ethical traditions within Labour history that have been somewhat marginalised. And the basic argument was that there are three traditions of justice that lie deep within Labour history. The first about maximising questions of welfare. Economic utility is its driving form. The second about maximising questions of human freedom or liberty. And the third about maximising human virtue, often called the ethical socialist tradition. And it was the third element that I wanted to seek to rehabilitate because it had been exiled within a lot of the debates in and around the Labour Party. And within that third tradition about virtue, there has been a further marginalisation about the role of the Catholic tradition within this ethical framework. So while ploughing through miles of Labour history textbooks, what was really interesting is the lack of any substantial work on the Catholic tradition to Labour history. And this omission is often accounted for by a number of reasons. Firstly, the politics of Irish nationalism and home rule prior to 1922 and the achievement of Irish self-government. Second, instruction of the clergy and traditional clerical suspicion of this emerging tradition of socialism, especially in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. Thirdly, opposition to Labour Party policy, especially over issues of Catholic schooling prior to the 1918 Education Act. And fourthly, a product of the restricted franchise in terms of working class involvement and limited Catholic participation at elections. So consequently, Catholic contribution has remained a neglected area of study, often replaced by a sort of deterministic secular Labour history, or one that focuses on dissenting Protestant traditions. And when Harold Wilson said Labour owes more to Methodism than Marxism, even in analysis of the late 19th century, what is often called by some historians the era of the religion of socialism, the contribution of the Catholic elements within that movement are regularly neglected. This is despite the emergence of Catholic social teaching in response to some of the indignities intrinsic to modern capitalism in the late 19th century. 1891, Rerum Novarum was published on the rights and duties of capital and labour. That's 9 years before the actual Labour Party was created in the form of the Labour Representation Committee. And as well, key trade union figures such as Tom McCarthy, Peter Curran, James Sexton have been written out of the Labour history, as well as the role of the Catholic Church, for example, in the 1889 London dock strike. So the plan this morning was to reintroduce this history, to talk about lost or exiled histories, to help navigate the current political situation in terms of the resources that might be available to us going forward. This would allow for a rethink of Catholic social teaching right back from the late 19th century into the current situation. And I think that return to history in terms of memory is vital. It helps us rethink the late 19th century and the inspiration behind much Catholic social thought. But moving forward, it also allows us to think through how, in the aftermath of fascism and genocide, that inspired the post-war development of international human rights, which was also informed by spiritual concerns about the question of the dignity of the person created in the image of God. So I guess much of the discussion will today bounce around these questions of the resources available to us, spiritual, theological, historical, political and organisational in terms of politics on the ground. So that's the route I was going to take. And then I reread Fratelli Tutti for today's event, and it took me a slightly different direction. Specifically, what struck me was the idea of a social encyclical with this explicit emphasis on questions of fraternity. And I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking through the present moment, because if you think about fraternity is often seen as part of its own sort of triptych, like the French tricolor: equality, liberty, fraternity. And it tends to disappear in a lot of the debates, in a similar way that the virtue tradition, in terms of different approaches to justice, tends to be de-emphasized. So that emphasis on fraternity, especially I was drawn to chapter 8 of the encyclical, Religion as the Service of Fraternity in Our World. And I was really struck by that as a way of rethinking, and almost as an antidote to the usages of religion in today's politics, because I would suggest to you that the political space is being quietly but radically, dramatically being reset around questions of religion and identity. Take the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch. Now, she gets dismissed by a lot of the political cognoscenti, but I think she might be tapping into something. What I find most significant is the way she emphasises the effects of the exile of religious sentiment from the public conversation. It's a theme she returns to again and again. She describes herself as an agnostic who is culturally Christian, whilst regularly noting that her grandfather was a Nigerian Methodist minister. And she identifies, I think, the potency of religious identity and links it to an almost evangelical hostility to what she sees as the progressive left and the bureaucratic state. She suggests conservatism must become a national force equipped with moral certainty in defence of the sacred. And it's that element, a sort of muscular politics in defence of the sacred, which I think is redrawing the terms of British politics. We've retreated very much from, 20 years ago, we were in an era of sort of evangelical secularism, the new atheism of writers such as Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, Hitchens, the four riders of the apocalypse, I seem to remember, who asserted a new age of reason, of a sort of disinterested scientism and the triumph of liberal rationality. Today, religious convictions appear culturally ascendant, captured in public conversions, figures such as Ayaan Hirsi Ali, one of the original new atheists, actually, views of Jordan Peterson, soccer players, rock stars, dodgy comedians such as Russell Brand. The list sort of goes on, all confidently expressing their belief systems. And the obvious question to me is, what is driving this renewed interest in spiritual concerns? Maybe pandemic, when we're forced to confront our own death and mortality, certainly migration, some of the cultural tensions that spin off out of that, the decline of our ideological traditions, political alienation, institutional distrust, social anxiety, the threats to humanity posed by technological change, the effects of conflict and war. It's a good day to consider that. I was talking to Jenny Sinclair yesterday about this, and she was talking about religion offering a sense of certainty in a world unravelling. So cumulatively there appears a distinct religious turn, which in the political sphere can be seen as a response to a secular progressive ideology deemed responsible for a sense of national decline. I disagree with that, but that is a recurring drumbeat in the public conversation. 2 decades ago, a new atheism was a reaction to the religious fundamentalism driving 9/11, and today political movements are consciously seeking to defend a sense of the sacred. Now, there's a real problem for the government here, whose approach to growth almost involves a suspension of the ethical and is not the answer to those seeking spiritual renewal, which is a politics of a very different order. So the real challenge is very different. And I am concerned about the way various ethno-nationalist forces are using religion to divide the political landscape, upend a sense of the common good, threaten how we live together. And I think we will witness noticeable community upheaval and religious conflict in the coming years. And some of the forces shaping these divisions are becoming clear. Learning from North America, many on the UK far right, such as Tommy Robinson, actually the product of Irish migration, but he is now playing with converting and consciously adopting Christian nationalist language and imagery to propel forward a sense of cultural dissent over both immigration and Islam. Reform and Nigel Farage will undoubtedly move in this direction, but in a similar vein to what's happening with J.D. Vance, Peter Thiel, Viktor Orban, we're likely to see a more distinct, aggressive Catholicism. But it's not just about Christian nationalism. Protests over the carnage and inhumanity in Gaza spilled over into last year's general election and foreshadowed the likely emergence of a new distinct Muslim UK political party, possibly in advance of next year's local elections. It's quite possible that in some of the local elections in next May, in some of our cities, the two big winners will be on the one hand Reform UK and on the other an embryonic Muslim political movement, at the expense of our traditional political parties. Obviously, the latter appears to reflect a disturbing breach with many of the 4 million strong Muslim community in the UK. Such developments operate alongside an emerging, more muscular Hindu nationalist political movement, with suggestions from covert support from overseas. The shifting political allegiances within the London borough of Harrow reflect the latter, whilst inter-religious tensions and violence between Hindu and Muslim communities across Leicester signal what might lie ahead in some of our urban settings. So the central question is what engagement with the major religions is occurring around these questions of identity, nationalism and religious extremism. Because we cannot rely on the government or parliament to resolve these tensions. Apart from a few noticeable exceptions, the Labour government often appears disinterested and ill-equipped to build the form of religious dialogue that the modern moment demands.
1 minute, John.
Thank you. This is where the sort of historic story about the Catholic tradition and the Labour Party lands in terms of its modern relevance, in terms of confronting ethno-nationalist identity and religious politics. And politicians need to excavate their own history. Liberal democracy, which once promised economic growth, social mobility, it guaranteed cultural and social reconciliation alongside political stability, it's now ushering in oligarchy, cost of living crisis, culture wars, political upheaval, all powered by modern technologies which atrophy our culture and reduce it to little more than forms of technologically powered data exchange. So the solution is not one of growth, it's about addressing some of the questions of meaning and purpose in our lives. I was the MP for Dagenham. We were sort of canary down the coal mine in terms of forms of nationalist politics in the BNP. And what seemed to me to lie underneath was increasingly distance between the lives that people were promised and they wish to leave and the lives they are forced to leave. And this distinction finds representation in the anger and rage that propelling a lot of our politics, born of humiliation. So, what resources we have? Let's talk about a different public conversation about the lives we wish to live, how we live together, our obligations to one another, and what gives our lives meaning, both individually and collectively. Let's call this the service of fraternity in our world. We are endowed with this tradition of Catholic social teaching. It's vital, given the current moment, that we operationalise it both theoretically, theologically, and practically in terms of organising with our communities. Thank you very much indeed.